Chapter 27. Lucky Number. Blanche Williams came into the dining room and took her seat at the dinner table for lunch. "The cat won't eat," she said. Jim Williams looked up from the Sotheby's auction catalogue he had brought with him to the table. He looked at the cat, who was sitting motionless in the doorway, and then returned his attention to the catalogue. Mrs. Williams unfolded her napkin and put it on her lap. "It's the same as last time," she said. "The cat wouldn't eat then either, or the time before that. It's happened every time we've come back from the courthouse to wait for the jury to make up its mind. She's refused to eat." William's sister, Dorothy Kingery, glanced at her watch. "It's 1:30, she said. "They've been at it for 3 hours now. I guess they're having lunch. I wonder if they'll take a break or go right on deliberating while they eat." Williams looked up from his catalogue magazine. "Listen to this," he said. "When Catherine of Bragzana, the Infanta of Portugal, arrived in England in 1662 to marry Charles II, she brought with her the largest dowry ever seen. Part of that dowry was the port of Bombay in India." He laughed. "Now that's the kind of princess I like." "This makes it the 3rd time she's done it," Mrs. Williams said. "Not touched her food." Dorothy Kingery regarded the sandwich on her plate. "Sonny says he called from the courthouse as soon as there's word. I hope we can hear the telephone from in here." "I don't know how she knows," Mrs. Williams mused softly, "but she always knows." Jim Williams suddenly closed the auction catalogue and stood up. "I've got an idea," he said. "We'll eat lunch on the dishes from the Nanking cartel, just for good luck." He took out several blue and white plates from the breakfast cabinet and passed them around the table. His mother and sister transferred their sandwiches from the plain white plates to the blue and white plates. The blue and white plates had been part of a huge shipment of Chinese export porcelain that had been lost in the South China Sea in 1752 and salvaged in 1983. Williams had bought several dozen plates, cups and bowls at a highly publicised Christie's auction, and they had arrived at Mercer House within the past few weeks. "These plates have been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 230 years, he said, "but they're still brand new. When they were found, they were in their original packing crates. They're mint condition. No one has ever eaten off of them before. We're the first. Funny way to preserve dishes, isn't it?" Mrs. Williams lifted her sandwich and looked at her plate. "You can't fool a cat," she said. 2 weeks earlier, on the first day of Williams's 3rd trial, the outcome had seemed a foregone conclusion, so much so that the Savannah Morning News had announced in a weary headline, "Williams faces yet another conviction for murder." The jury of 9 women and 3 men seemed predisposed to hand down a 3rd conviction, all of them having been subjected to the relentless publicity, admitted they knew about the case and were well aware that the 2 prior juries had already found Williams guilty. The tension and suspense of the first 2 trials had given way to a feeling of grim inevitability. Television cameras were stationed outside the courthouse once again, but this time the spectator benches in the courtroom were only half full. Prentice Crowe declared he would not even bother to read the news reports. It was all becoming such a bore. "It's the same old story over and over," he said. "It's like reruns of I Love Lucy." The courthouse flack was among those who did attend. He sat slumped in his seat with one arm over the back, as if to keep himself from sliding off onto the floor. As usual, he was the oracle of the courthouse wisdom and rumour. "Jim Williams' guilt or innocence is no longer the issue," he said. Spencer Lawton's incompetence is the issue. The question on everybody's mind is, how long will he keep screwing up? I mean, this case is getting to be like a bad bullfight. Lawton's the matador who can't finish off the bull. Twice now he's plunged the sword in, but the bull's still on his feet, and the fans are getting restless. Lawton looks ridiculous. The prosecution led off with its by now familiar repertory company of witnesses. The police photographer, the officers who came to Mercer House the night of the shooting, the lab technicians. Each responded to Spencer Lawton's questions, then submitted to cross-examination by Sonny Seiler, and then left the stand. Judge Oliver nodded sleepily on the bench. The courthouse flack yawned. "What part did you play in the removal of the body from Mercer House?" Lawton asked Detective Joseph Jordan, as he had in the first two trials. "I bagged the hands," Jordan answered. "Could you explain to the jury what you mean by bagging the hands and what the purpose of that might be?" "Anytime there's a shooting," said Detective Jordan, "and you have reason to believe that the dead person has fired a weapon, paper bags are placed over the hands to prevent any foreign substance from getting on the hands and contaminating them, or any gunpowder residue, if there is any, from being accidentally wiped off." A poker-faced Sonny Seiler cross-examined the unsuspecting Detective Jordan. "What kind of bags did you use?" "Paper bags." "What did you bind them with?" "I believe it was evidence tape." "Are you absolutely sure those hands were bagged before they left the house?" "I bagged them," said Jordan. When the prosecution rested its case, Sonny Seiler rose to call his first witness. "Call Marilyn Case," he said. A fresh face, a new witness, a change in the script. The courthouse flack leaned forward in his seat. Judge Oliver opened both eyes. Lawton and his assistant exchanged wary glances. She was curly-headed and blonde, about 40, and she wore a grey suit with a white silk blouse. She said that she had worked as a nurse in Candler Hospital for 15 years. Before that, she had served as assistant coroner of Chatham County. Yes, when she had been on duty in the Candler emergency room when Danny Hansford's body was brought in. Seiler handed her a copy of the hospital admissions sheet, then strode nonchalantly past Spencer Lawton and dropped another copy on the table in front of him. While Lawton and his assistant huddled over the piece of paper, Seiler placed a blow-up of it on an easel in front of the jury and went on with his questioning. "Let me ask you this, Mrs. Case. Do you recognize this document?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Is that your handwriting on it?" "Yes, sir, it is." "Tell this jury, Miss Case, ma'am, whether or not Danny Hansford's hands were bagged when you brought him into the hospital." "No, sir, they were not." A murmur of surprise swept the courtroom. Judge Oliver gavelled the room to silence. "All right, Mrs. Case," Seiler went on. "So you bagged the hands yourself?" "Yes, I did." "How did you do it?" "I got 2 plastic garbage bags, placed them over both hands, and wrapped adhesive tape around the wrists." After a brief and faltering cross-examination by a shaken Spencer Lawton, Marilyn Case stepped down from the stand. Seiler next called Dr. Stone, the forensic pathologist. Dr. Stone said that because Hansford's hands had not been bagged before he was moved to the hospital, all traces of gunshot residue could easily have been wiped off. He then added gently that by using plastic bags instead of paper bags, the well-meaning Marilyn Case had actually made matters worse. "Plastic bags are an absolute no-no," he said. "They create static electricity, which can actually pull particles from the hand. Furthermore, if the body is then placed in a refrigerated morgue bin for 5 hours, as Hansford's body was, condensation forms inside the plastic and the water runs off the hands." In light of all that, Seiler asked. "Are you surprised that there was no gunshot residue on Hansford's hand?" "I'd been surprised if there had been any," said Dr. Stone. Television stations cut into their afternoon programming with the news flash. Shocking new evidence has come to light in the Jim Williams murder trial. The district attorney has been taken by surprise. Word around the courthouse is that Williams will walk. Later that night, Sonny Seiler arrived at the 1790 restaurant for diner. Later that night, Sonny Seiler arrived at the 1790 restaurant for dinner and received a standing ovation. Lawton, having lost the use of his leading piece of evidence, shifted gears for his final argument. "We don't need the gunshot residue test to prove Jim Williams is guilty," he said. "It's only one piece of evidence among many." Point by point, he enumerated the surviving evidence against Jim Williams: the placement of bullet fragments, the bits of paper on the gun, the trajectory of fire, the chair leg on Hansford's pants, the blood on Hansford's hands, but no blood on the gun. In particular, he focused on the 36-minute gap between the time Hansford was shot and the time Williams made the call to the police. "What did Jim Williams do in that 36 minutes?" Lawton asked. "I'll tell you what he did. He got another gun, went over to where Danny was lying, and shot a bullet into the desk. Then he pulled Danny's hand out from under his body and put it over the gun. What did he do for the balance of the time? I'll tell you what he did. He went around the house selectively destroying furniture." Lawton held up the police photographs of the interior of Mercer House. "This is the grandfather clock Danny Hansford allegedly knocked over. It's face down in the hall. Notice how the base of the clock is still very close to the wall. I submit that it's not where it would be if a strong 21-year-old like Danny Hansford had thrown it over in a violent rage. It would have hit the tile floor and skidded down the hall. But it's barely moved from the wall. That's because Jim Williams did it. He leaned the clock over carefully and let it drop a few inches off the floor, high enough to crack the glass, but not high enough to damage it beyond repair. If you recall, Jim Williams said he was able to restore it and sell it. Now, let's see what other damage was done. A chair and a table were turned over, a silver tray knocked off a table, an Atari set was stomped, and a half pint of bourbon was smashed. The total damage being what? $120.17? I don't know. But I ask you to look at all the expensive antiques that weren't broken. Chests, tables, paintings, worth $50,000, $100,000. Ask yourself whether a young man on a murderous rampage, tearing up the furniture in the house of somebody who loved antiques, would have stopped at the trifling damage he did. Of course not. That furniture was broken, if you will, by a man who loved it. Jim Williams. The solemn faces in the jury box gave every indication that Lawton had recouped at least some of the ground he had lost earlier. Lawton's voice was heavy with sarcasm. What Jim Williams didn't do in those 36 minutes was call for an ambulance. He's been described as a compassionate man who makes contributions to the Humane Society. Well, he didn't even call the Humane Society to come check on Danny Hansford. A young female juror wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. We can spot them the gunshot residue test, Lawton said. We don't need it to convict Jim Williams. By the end of the day, the palpable shift in the jury's mood had alarmed Sonny Seiler. Lawton had effectively rebuilt his case around the surviving pieces of physical evidence, diverting attention from the embarrassment of the bagged hands. There was nothing Seiler could do about it now. He had already rested his case and delivered his closing argument. The judge had sent the jury home for the night. The next morning he read his instructions, and the jury retired to consider the verdict. Back at Mercer House, the Williamses finished their sandwiches in silence. Mrs. Williams folded her napkin and gazed out at the window. Dorothy fidgeted with a spoon. Williams flipped through the Sotheby's catalogue, not really reading. The telephone rang. It was Sonny Seiler reporting that the jury were having hamburgers for lunch. At 4:30, Seiler called again to say that the jury have asked to have a dictionary sent in. One of the jurors did not know the meaning of the word malice. At 5:30, Judge Oliver had sent the jury home for the weekend, still deadlocked. Seiler had learned from the bailiffs, who were notorious for prying and telling tales, that the jurors were evenly split. Deliberations resumed at 10 o'clock Monday morning. Around noon, Seiler noticed that bailiffs were suddenly stopped talking to him. They averted their eyes when he passed in the corridor. This was an ominous sign. "That means it's coming down in favour of the prosecution," he said. By 3 o'clock, the split had widened to 11-1 in favour of conviction. The forewoman of the jury sent a note to the judge. "There is one person who refuses to change her mind no matter what we say or do." Within minutes, the bailiffs let it be known that the lone holdout was a woman named Cecilia Tyo, a feisty divorcee in her late 50s. Mrs. Tyo had told the other jurors that years ago she had found herself in a life or death situation not unlike the one Jim Williams described. Her live-in boyfriend had come into the kitchen in a drunken rage and tried to strangle her while she was cooking dinner. Just as she was about to black out, she grabbed a fillet knife and stabbed him in the ribs, wounding but not killing him. Mrs. Tyo said she understood the meaning of self-defense better than anyone else on the jury, and she would not change her vote. "My 3 children are all grown up," she said. "I don't have to go home and cook. I don't have any responsibilities. I can stay here as long as any of you." At 5 o'clock, the judge summoned all parties into the courtroom. Williams came from Mercer House, Seiler from his office. The jury took its place in the jury box. Mrs. Tyo, her white hair in a bun, sat with her jaw set, staring sullenly at the floor. She neither looked at nor spoke to the other jurors. "Madam Foreman, have you arrived at a verdict?" "I'm sorry, Your Honour," the forewoman said. "We have not." "Do you believe that if you deliberate further you will get a verdict?" "I'm beginning to believe, Your Honour, that we could deliberate until hell freezes over and still not get a verdict." Sonny Seiler moved for a mistrial, but Judge Oliver brusquely declined it. Instead, over Seiler's objections, he read a dynamite charge to the jury, which essentially told them in blunt terms to stop dawdling and come to a unanimous decision. He then adjourned the proceedings until 10 o'clock the next morning, admonished the jurors, as he had done many times before, not to read, listen to, or watch any news reports of the trial, and not to discuss the case with anyone. Jim Williams drove home from the courthouse, but instead of going inside, he walked across the street into Monterey Square and sat down on a bench next to Minerva. "Oh, my lawyers have fucked it up again," he said. "There's only one juror who's still on my side. It's a woman." "How strong is she?" Minerva asked. "I don't know. Pretty ornery, I think. But she'll be under a lot of pressure tonight. The DA knows who she is, and he's desperate to break her. We've got to stop him." "You know where she live at?" "I can find out. Can you protect her?" Minerva gazed out into space. "There's things I can do." "Well, this time, I want you to use your most potent weapons." Minerva nodded. "When I get through laying down my shit, she'll be safe all right." "Do me a favor," said Williams. "Whenever you do whatever you're gonna do, use something that belonged to Dr. Buzzard, like one of his old socks, or a shirt or comb, anything. Minerva gave Williams a look of irritation. I didn't keep none of his socks. If I did, I wouldn't know in the hell where to start looking for 'em in that mess I got of a house. Well, but you have other things of his. I don't know. I didn't keep nothing. I didn't really know the man that good. Now, Minerva, we've known each other too long for that. Williams spoke as if he were addressing a recalcitrant child. Those are his purple spectacles you're wearing, aren't they not? Minerva heaved a sigh. Let's see. I think I ran across a pair of his shoes the other day. Oh, Lord, I don't know what I done with them shoes. It don't have to be a shoe. What else you got? Minerva gazed up into the tree. Well, somewhere, if I had the strength to look for it, I might find something. Yeah, something. She smiled. I think I even got his false teeth somewhere. Well, now's the time to use 'em, said Williams, a note of urgency entering his voice. I don't want anybody messing with that woman tonight. They may try messing, said Minerva, but if they do, they're gonna fall sick real quick. May even die. That won't do me any good, Williams said. I don't want anybody getting to her at all, period. What can you do about that? I'll go to the flower garden late tonight, she said. At dead time. I'll talk to the old man. Good. A smile swept itself across the moonscape of Minerva's round face. And when I get through dealing with your business, I'll make him give me a number. Oh, don't do that, Minerva. You know he won't give you one. You'll just make him angry. No, tonight's not the night for that. Minerva's smile withered to a pout. I need a number so I can play, so I can get me some damn money, she said. All right, God damn it, I'll give you the number myself right now. Minerva looked sharply at Williams. You always said I was wise, he said. Yes, I know. You was born with a veil over your face, baby. You do have a gift. Tell me how many numbers you need. I need a triple number, like 1, 2, 3. It can be the same number 3 times or 3 different numbers. All right, said Williams. Let me concentrate for a second. Then I'll give you a number that will win you a handful of money. Williams closed his eyes. The numbers are 6, 8, and 1. 6, 8, 1, Minerva repeated. That's right. Now, how much money does it take to play it? $1, $5, 10? A flicker of doubt crossed Minerva's face. You might be teasing me. I don't tease, said Williams. But you haven't answered my question. What does it take to cover the bet? $6. How much would you win if you won? 300. But hey, this thing played 2 tricks, she said. Which track to play? New York or Brooklyn? Me, I play New York track. I don't want to play 681 on New York and have it come up in Brooklyn. Which one to play? Can't you play both? Hell no. That'll take another $6. And listen, the man that writes the numbers for the other track for Brooklyn, he lives 70 miles from me. So I got to have the number for the New York track. Williams closed his eyes again. Okay, I see it now. The New York track. Play 681 on the New York track. You'll win $300 for sure. I'll give you the $6 to cover the bet. Minerva took the money. But remember one thing, said Williams. 681 will only work if you leave Dr. Buzzard alone tonight and don't hound him for a number. If you bug him, 681 will automatically become worthless.
I'll leave him be, baby.
Good. I want the two of you to concentrate on only one thing tonight, keeping Mrs. Tayo on my side. I don't want you or the old man wasting energy on numbers again until this thing is over. Minerva nodded solemnly. Don't you worry about that $300. It's as good as in your pocket. You follow me? Minerva stuffed the $6 into her bag.
Yeah, baby, I follow you.
The third floor of the Chatham County Courthouse was a scene of turmoil and confusion at 10 o'clock the next morning. The doors of Judge Oliver's courtroom remained chained and padlocked. The crowd of spectators milling around in the corridor was augmented by the presence of Sheriff Michael and half a dozen of his deputies. The crowd of spectators milling around in the corridor was augmented by the presence of Sheriff Mitchell and half a dozen of his deputies. The sheriff and his men had come to the courthouse in anticipation of a guilty verdict. Afterward, they would escort Williams through the underground passage to jail. But the padlock on the courtroom door was unusual. It meant that the session would be delayed in starting. Something unexpected had happened. This is what it was. At 7 that morning, Spencer Lawton had received a telephone call from a paramedic who worked for Lifestar, an emergency medical service. The paramedic had said that at 2:30, an anonymous woman had called the service and asked medical questions pertaining to a shooting between an older man and a younger man. How long would it take for blood to congeal on a man's hand? How quickly would a person die if he had been shot in the aorta? Though she refused to identify herself, the woman eventually admitted she was a juror in the Jim Williams case, and that she was the only one who believed Williams was innocent. She added that the other jurors had commented that the case was just about a couple of faggots, and they should convict Williams and go home. Layton immediately called Judge Oliver and demanded that Miss Tayo be expelled from the jury for discussing the case outside the jury room, and be replaced by one of the alternate jurors. This would all but guarantee a guilty verdict. Seiler, when he heard it, insisted the judge declare a mistrial. At 10 o'clock, while the crowd buzzed in the corridor outside the locked courtroom, Judge Oliver convened a Star Chamber session in his office in an effort to deal with the situation. In the presence of Lawton, Seiler, a court stenographer, and the paramedic, the judge summoned each of the jurors individually and asked them under oath if they had called a paramedic in the middle of the night to discuss the case. Each said no, including Miss Tayo, although when Miss Tayo left the room, the paramedic told the judge that voice was familiar to him. Out in the corridor, speculation centered on three possibilities: that Miss Tayo had made the call, that the paramedic had been duped by someone acting in league with the prosecution, and that the paramedic was in active collusion with the prosecution. Having failed to get a confession out of anybody, Judge Oliver reconvened the courtroom and called the court back into session. Once again, he asked the jurors if any of them had discussed the case with a paramedic. None spoke up. Miss Tayo, looking distressed, held a handkerchief to her mouth. She had confided to the forewoman that she had recently suffered a heart attack and was afraid she might be on the verge of another. Seiler moved again for a mistrial. The judge rebuffed him and sent the jury, including Miss Tayo, back into deliberations. In the expectation that something might happen soon, Williams went out into the corridor to wait. Minerva was sitting alone at the far end. He walked over and stood in front of her. She spoke to him as if in a trance.
Last night I done this, took the old man's teeth and buried them in that lady's yard, just like you said.
They've been up to mischief anyhow, said Williams. They've concocted a story and they're trying to throw her off the jury.
That would be their only hope, said Minerva. 'Cause she ain't switching sides, that's for sure. I ain't lying. The old man done took the case hisself the whole time. Yeah, huh? And after midnight, me and Delia worked the DA and the judge, up one side and down the other.
Williams smiled. Did you play that number I gave you?
Didn't have no time to play it. I've been too busy.
Around noon, the judge called the jury back into the courtroom and asked if there had been any movement toward a decision. There had not. Reluctantly, he declared a mistrial and gavelled the proceedings to a close. Amid the ensuing commotion, Spencer Lawton's voice could be heard calling out to the judge. For the record, Judge, I will ask the court administrator to set this case down for retrial as soon as possible. A fourth trial would set a record. Jim Williams would become the first person ever to be tried 4 times for murder in the state of Georgia. The courthouse flack laughed and slapped his thighs and hooted that the matador was now bloodier than the bull. Downstairs, the television crews converged on Lawton, who, though bloody, was still unbowed. After 3 trials, he said, the score is 35-1 for the conviction. I'm confident that if we get a jury that is willing and able to decide, we will get the right verdict. As he spoke, a small crowd gathered in front of him. Minerva stood on its periphery, a broad smile on her face, and 3 crisp $100 bills crumpled in her hand. Later that evening, Williams sipped Madeira and played round after round of psycho dice. His grey tiger cat, having just eaten the last bite of her food in 2 days, lay sleeping in his lap. Williams calculated that his 3rd trial had cost him roughly $250,000. As far as I'm concerned, he said, only $300 of it was worth a damn.